Good evening. I'm Mike McGrath, President of Preservation Delaware, and I want to welcome you to our webinar this evening, presented by Betsy Hatch, Preservation Planner for Newcastle County. We're so glad that you decided to join us this evening. I hope that you will consider joining Preservation Delaware as one of our members. We're not only looking for members because of our dues, which we can use to help support our programs, but we also need your voice to speak up with our voices on behalf of standing up for those things that are being torn down. Our job in Delaware, for Preservation Delaware, is to stand up for our historic treasures, our landmarks, our archaeological sites, those things which tie us to our history and which guide us into the future. Again, thanks for joining us this evening, and I hope you enjoy this webinar. Now, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our moderator for this evening, Alex Tarantino. Alex is an architectural historian with the Delaware Department of Transportation and helps to manage DelDOT's Cultural Resources Program. Alex is responsible for the review and coordination of transportation projects across Delaware to ensure compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. She's a subject matter expert. She conducts architectural history surveys, assesses project impacts, and provides technical expertise and guidance to avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts to our cultural resources. Prior to joining DelDOT, Alex worked as a historic preservation specialist with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Alex earned her BA in art history and a certificate in historic preservation from Rutgers University, and completed her master's in historic preservation at the University of Delaware, where she worked on the Mid-Atlantic Historic Buildings and Landscape Survey at CHAD, the Center for Historic Architecture and Design. She has served on our Preservation Delaware Board of Directors since 2019 and is chair of the Education Committee. And I want to compliment Alex and her committee on the great job they've been doing during the year of the pandemic on bringing great webinars like this one to the people of Delaware. Alex, it's all yours.
Thanks, Mike. That was a very nice introduction. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for being here. As Mike said, my name is Alex Tarantino. I'm really excited to be your moderator tonight for this month's installment of Preservation Delaware's workshop series. We're calling it Unsolved Histories, Researching Old Properties in Delaware. I'm a lifelong history lover, and I'm an architectural historian by training, so research is near and dear to me. I've managed to build my career on it. Preservation Delaware has received many requests for a workshop on this topic, so we're really excited to have Betsy Hatch here with us tonight to teach us a little about how to conduct historic property research. Betsy and I have worked together several times throughout my time at DelDOT, and I can't say enough about her expertise in this subject, so you are all in great hands tonight. So before I introduce Betsy, I just wanted to give a couple reminders. All attendees are muted, so if you have a question, we're asking that you please use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. I'll be keeping track of all the questions and comments that are received, and we plan to take those questions after Betsy's presentation. You can also use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to get in touch with us. If you have a question or you are having technical difficulties, we can try to help you out with that. So this workshop is being recorded, so it'll be available in a few weeks on Preservation Delaware's YouTube channel. Lastly, we will be using the Zoom polling function tonight to get some input from everyone. So after I introduce Betsy, we're going to do an intro poll that's designed to learn a little more about our attendees, particularly about your backgrounds and your interest and familiarity in this topic. And then we'll also have an exit poll at the end for everyone to answer. All right, so welcome, Betsy. Betsy is the preservation planner for Newcastle County, and she oversees historic preservation activities in the Department of Land Use, including providing staff support to the Newcastle County Historic Review Board. Betsy works to coordinate historic preservation projects undertaken by other county departments and Newcastle County residents through the land development and historic review process to ensure compliance with the county's historic regulations. As part of this process, she conducts historic research and evaluates properties for eligibility for Newcastle County's historic overlay zoning, providing guidance on how to enhance and to minimize potential impacts to historic resources. In the course of her job duties, Betsy is also charged with partnering with the State Historic Preservation Office through the Certified Local Government Program. Prior to joining Newcastle County in 2018, Betsy worked for Kent County Levy Court as a planner, where she engaged in zoning and land development review, as well as comprehensive planning. Betsy received a BA in Historic Preservation from the University of Mary Washington, where she focused on architectural history, archaeology, and urban planning. During her time at the University of Mary Washington, she worked as an intern and preservation technician for a local cultural resource firm, where she gained valuable experience in cultural resource management. So Betsy, again, welcome and thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to have you. All right, so really quick, before Betsy takes it away, I'm gonna bring up that first poll that I had mentioned. So let's see. All right, can everybody see that poll up on their screens? If yes or no, just let me know in the chat. And I'll leave this up for about 30 seconds or so and give people a chance to answer just a few questions. So what's your interest in this topic? You know, are you a homeowner, a resident? Are you a preservation professional, a real estate professional? The second question, are you a Delaware resident? And then the third question asks how familiar you are with property research and the different sources that are available in Delaware. So awesome. All right. So it looks like got half of people, a little over half of people have voted so far. All right, so we've got, let's see, we've got about 75% of people have answered so far. For the first question, it looks like we have the majority are homeowners or residents, but we also have 33% are preservation professionals, historians, or work in a related field. So that's really awesome. Got a couple of real estate professionals, one student, and a good bit of others, so our history buffs. Most are Delaware residents, 79%. And then it looks like we've got a pretty varied familiarity with the resources in Delaware. So that's great. I think this will be good for you all who are familiar a little bit. And then we have a couple of people who have never done it before. So I think this will be really awesome. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end that. All right, Betsy, whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks, Alex, and good evening, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and so excited to talk about researching history, historical properties, and it's kind of fun to be able to put on another hat for the night, because usually I'm looking at land development plans and legal notices. So in addition to doing work with the Historic Review Board, so it's fun to get to talk about something that I really like. Let me share my screen here. All right, can everyone see my screen? Okay. All right, so if any of you guys are like me and you're driving down a road and you see a really cool building, like, I wonder what the story is with that. And as long as you don't drive off the road, just like my husband knows that he's ready to hold the steering wheel just in case I get a little too distracted. I always find myself wondering about, my surroundings and what the history was, always thinking about what the landscape looked before everyone was everywhere. Or maybe you're lucky enough to live in a historic home and you want to know more about who occupied the walls that you're in and how your property may or may not have changed. We as people really want to feel that connection to our past and our surroundings. And I think, especially nowadays when we have kind of been forced to to keep away from each other, and we're very hyper aware of how important our surroundings are and what is in our surroundings, because we've actually had a kind of a chance to stop and take a look at, oh, this is all around me. I never noticed that before. So, if you want to learn how to research a historic building, or you find yourself wanting to learn more, I'm just hoping that this presentation will give you the tools that you would like to that you could use, so you could kind of go down the rabbit hole and researching historic properties, which historic is now considered 50 years or older. It can be exciting, it can be frustrating, it can be tedious, and it's a blast all at the same time. So just hopefully, all of you guys get some useful tools from this. So just like Bob Ross says, let's go crazy. What the heck? Let's see here. All right, so in order to get started, you do need some basic information about a property that will help you go look for other facts and clues about your property. So this might seem very obvious, but as you look deeper and into older records, it's important to have these fundamental root items on hand. So obviously, a property's address, also the parcel number for a property. You'll need the deed reference if you're going to do a chain of title or deed research, and the 100 that the property, where a property is located in. So, and if you don't know what 100 is, like me, when I moved to Delaware, because I'm originally from Virginia, and I was like, what in the world is 100? Delaware was broken up into geographic areas in the 17th century. The original reason for this is suspected to be that in the Old World, territory was divided into areas large enough to contain 100 residents or families for the purpose of defense or local government, and that these areas became known as hundreds. So the term was brought here when William Penn in 1682 divided the counties of Delaware into geographic areas, calling them hundreds for the purpose of taxation. So although the term was used in neighboring counties in Maryland and Pennsylvania, Delaware is the only one of the original colonies to still use this term to describe the subdivision of its land. So where can you find this information? Each county has their own property identification system and GIS mapping service. And I do have links in this presentation, so it can be shared, and feel free to go explore and check them out. Each county, they're called something different. So, and usually they do contain data and the information that you need on the municipal properties as well, so the unincorporated areas. So in Newcastle County, it's referred to as parcel search. In Kent County, it's Pride, and Sussex County is property record search. Each GIS mapping service has information on various features of properties that are not just historic. They have environmental features, they have land use, zoning, assessment, what council district or elected official district you're in. So they're really, really useful tools just to know more about your property. So here are just some screenshots of Newcastle County, Kent County, and Sussex. Okay, so another, once you kind of know where your property is located and you get familiar with the mapping and the geography of the surrounding area, when was your property constructed? What can a building tell you? So there are physical clues that we can look at. And these clues can not only help you determine what period your house was constructed in, it can also help you understand societal values of the time. It can tell you building trends and building materials and what was popular at a given point in history. So some physicals that we can look at. I usually start by trying to understand the architectural style of the building. Was it built in a very symmetrical and simplistic manner, like a Georgian house, or does it have a tower with different types of shingles, like we see in a lot of Queen Anne, which would be the late 19th century? Or does it have a certain window pattern that helps me identify this particular style? That's what you should look at first. When we start to peel back the layers, we can also look at the interior floor plan and how the space within a building is configured. This can be a key clue into understanding, when and how a building was built. And, we as people actually really like repetition. So we have surprisingly consistent floor plans throughout time. So I'm always surprised how much a floor plan can really tell us. Additions, maybe a building was added to over time as owners and residents needed additional space, or they had additional funds to make improvements to a building. We can also look at basements and attics, the skeletons of buildings, and looking at these aspects can help us understand what it looked like over time, what different periods of constructions there were. Also, building materials, we know that a lot of brick masonry structures are older, and were often used in early colonial times throughout the 19th century, but at some point we kind of moved more towards frame construction. And finally, we can look at the interior modifications and renovations to understand how it's changed over time. So usually the first thing you see is the outside, right? Unless of course you've been blindfolded and taken inside, that's usually not the case. Many of us can look at a building and have a general idea as to what century it's built in. For example, a rural bungalow up at the top left was likely going to date to the beginning of the 20th century, whereas a stone dwelling in the Piedmont region of Delaware likely dates somewhere between the 18th and 19th century. So sometimes you do have surprises too. A lot of times buildings will evolve over time, and you'll find original dwellings within houses too, which is actually kind of fun to find, but houses have many secrets. So if you are unfamiliar with architectural styles, or you simply want to learn more, some helpful books that I have found are Everyday Architecture of the Mid-Atlantic by Gabrielle Lanier and Bernard Herrmann, as well as A Field Guide to American Houses by Virginia Savage McAllister. Both of these books are phenomenal, but if you really want to learn about Delaware buildings in particular, look at Everyday Architecture of the Mid-Atlantic, because oh my gosh, I'm always so excited. I was very excited when I kind of rediscovered this book because it has everything, even information on barns and agricultural buildings that we have a lot of in Delaware. And I'll be the first to admit I'm not a barn expert. So whenever I have that book and I look at that book, I'm like, wow, I can feel really prepared when I go out and look at barns. So, and interior floor plans. I don't know if I'm the only one who's like this, but I get so interested whenever I go inside of a building, and I always want to know what the layout is. Maybe I read too many integer books and I wanted to find a secret staircase somewhere. I don't know. What I do know is that we can learn a lot from building form and the way interior space is oriented and configured. So as I mentioned earlier, when we build buildings, we are surprisingly consistent, and what we like our space around us to function for our needs, right? For example, structures built in early colonial America that had 2 rooms are commonly referred to as hall and parlor plans. But as people began to settle within the colonies, and there was additional resources and funds and and additional wealth, we moved to what we call closed plans, which have the centrally located hall with the doors on each side, so separating the heated room and spaces on each side of the house. So even Delaware bungalows have their own unique configurations and how the space was laid out. They tend to be more compact and informal in their arrangement of rooms. And also, again, Everyday Architecture of the Mid-Atlantic, that book that I was just describing, that has a slew of information about interior plans. So additions to historic structures are quite common. While some of them are hard to identify, a lot of times you can kind of figure out, okay, that looks a little different than that area. Some key things to look for are changes in the exterior materials, interruptions in siding or brick bond or masonry. Roof lines are also kind of usually roofs have been replaced, but you can tell by the roof line, like, oh, that kind of has a little dip right there. Some other alterations and modifications to buildings could also be like decorative elements, such as gingerbread details added to a Greek revival house. So just some examples that are shown on the slide here at the bottom right, Kingston Up and Hole in Kent County, we can see that the house was added onto at some point. You can tell in the brick bond, I'm having trouble saying that, on the first story. Also, if you look at the chimneys and their spacing, it's pretty clear that one came after the other. One side of the building came onto the other. So this is important to understand how your building has changed over time, because different periods of construction have different clues and kind of are indicative of the time that they were built. So if you're doing like a preservation project and you're like, I want to restore it back to this point in time, knowing the different periods of construction will help. So for example, we actually just had the Weldon House, which is the top picture there, which is currently now owned by the state of Delaware. And they are looking to adaptively reuse it, but they also want to restore it back to the time period where the Weldon House or the Weldon family actually owned the property and lived in it. So there was, some 1920s additions that, were going to be removed and bring it back to, the time period or its period of significance. So we can also look at basements and attics, and that those can also be places where we can find, hey, this was added onto at some point, or, what the structural system was like. So, and I'd like to think, the reason that we find basements and attics creepy is because that's where we can really see the skeleton of the house, right? There's something somewhat eerie about, the unlivable and unfinished spaces, but you can find so many clues there. I actually follow this one couple on Instagram called, their page is called Our Restoration Nation. And they always talk about, the structural system in their basements as kind of seeing the undergarments of the house, which I think is a really cute but accurate way of kind of describing these spaces. So what can we find in basements? We can find evidence of the original floor plan. You can, when you walk down into a cellar, if you're looking at the floor joists, do they go the same way as the kind of the rooms that are oriented on the first floor, or are they different? Are there interruptions? Could there have been a stairway that was once there? Are the foundation walls, are they stone? Are they brick? Do they have, is there some concrete block over there? Well, that's obviously an addition. So those are kind of things that you can work through in your mind. What you can also see, which I always think is really cool, you can see the structural supports for fireplaces and chimneys. So kind of shown in that middle top picture and the picture on the top right. You'll see those really neat arches that provided support for the fireplaces. So you can see how the structure was supported and worked. So as far as attics go, the framing in the attic can tell you what type of construction was used at the time. Was it a frame building, or what type of roof was put on at the time, what type of methods were used to cut the lumber, different roof replacements. Was there a chimney that was extant at one point but then had been removed or relocated? Those are kind of some key clues that you can find about how your building might have changed over time. So building materials are also, kind of talking about lumber and how it was, cut. A lot of times you can actually date a structure from the type of materials, which might be common sense, but what type of lumber did they use? Was it hand hewn? Well, it's going to be a lot earlier, or was it cut with a circular saw, which you can tell kind of when looking at the wood and you see those round kind of divots, or was it machine cut, which is a little more modern? One of the really interesting things I always found, especially learning about in-field school and kind of going out in the field when when I was trained in archaeology was looking at different types of nails, because a lot of the times that's what we would find. And you can actually date a site from the type of nail that was used. So if you're looking, you can see kind of, and the picture might be a little small, but you can tell by the head of the nail or the shaft of the nail that it was either cut from a machine or maybe it was hand wrought. Hand wrought is going to be a little earlier than wire cut nails, which are what we use today. Or I'm sorry, machine cut nails are what we use today. So we can see, looking at the picture at the top right, that's a structure in Sussex County. That's a brick masonry structure. So obviously that's going to be a little earlier, but sometimes masonry construction comes a little later. So we know rock-based concrete, like the Vogel house down on the bottom left, that was constructed in 1915. And that's just a really interesting structure altogether. So it's kind of hidden in Kent County, where it was built by Bohemian immigrants that never had architectural training, but they designed and built this house with this rock-faced concrete to kind of emulate, a classic mansion, a historic mansion. And a lot of the materials they actually got from Sears Roebuck. So I had to put that one in there because it's kind of an enigma, because it looks like something that you'd find, you'd think it would be much older, but it's actually not, kind of based on where it is. So maybe in your research, you come across a historic photo of a building and you can see how it changed over time. So one of our certified local government grant projects in Newcastle County was partnering with the University of Delaware Center for Historic Architecture and Design for a National Register listing of St. Daniel's UAME Church of Iron Hill, which is believed to be one of the earliest free Black congregations affiliated with the Peter Spencer movement in Delaware, constructed in 1852. So in their research, the folks at CHAD actually found a historic photograph kind of dating to the 1930s, and were able to tell, although that the building originally looked one way, but if you really take a look at it and compare how it is today and what it used to look like, it maintains the same fenestration pattern, especially with the 3 windows down the side and then the window up in the half story of the gable. So we can see, well, this building changed over time, with modifications as the congregation's needs kind of evolved. All right, so looking at historic maps, that's really fun. So this is a list of maps that I find to be the most helpful. Ray and Price map from 1849. There's the A.D. Biles map of Kent County. The Bureau's Atlas from 1868, which is the whole entire state. We were spoiled in Newcastle County. We have the Hopkins map in 1881, also the Bice Atlas in 1893. And then if you're in towns, you can also look at Sanborn insurance maps, which are really cool and actually really detailed. So where to find these maps? You can find them in the public archives. You can find them at the Delaware Historical Society. You can find them at the Library of Congress. Hagley Museum and Library, I believe, has them, as well as Delaware Geological Survey. So like I had mentioned, if you're in a town, Sanborn insurance maps are really useful because you can see the type of building, what it looked like on a certain block, and what was there and what it was used for at a certain point in time. So for example, based on the 1891 Sanborn map in Seaford, I can tell that there was a drugstore located on the corner of Arch Street and High Street. And I can also tell that the road of Arch Street was 40 feet wide, which is really helpful when you're looking at how streetscapes change over time. And also there are the addresses along the block too, which is incredibly helpful. So bless the people who thought about writing stuff down. So maps can come in handy when you're identifying what it was used for. So say in unincorporated areas of Newcastle County, we don't have those insurance maps, but we do have the Beers Atlas, for example. So we had an application come through our office, and I went out and took a look at this structure, and I said, that left side is really interesting, and it looks old, but I don't quite understand. What could that be? So I go look at the Beers Atlas, and lo and behold, I see the W. Kennedy Post Office and General Store. Then when I go back and look at the building, I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, because you have that parapeted roof, you have the central door, the cellar is located right next to the door for easy access. So that's how we're able to kind of identify what a building was used for at some point. So deeds. Now that you've looked at your building, you've kind of you might have looked at its physical features, you may have looked up on a map. Who owned your property? Who built your house? So this is where deeds can come in handy. And deed research, it can be really, really fun, or it can be really frustrating because you will run into dead ends, but you keep persevering and you keep finding different names and references, and you can kind of keep looking. So deeds can tell you, the size and features of your property at one point in time. It can tell you what sort of features there are, where their water course is, was there a stream? The property line goes to the middle of a dirt road at some point. Those are all types of things that you can tell, was a property subdivided over time? So there are deeds offices in each county. They do have stuff on the municipalities as well, the land records for the municipalities. You can also find land records at the Delaware Public Archives. The University Center for Historic Architecture and Design has those records. And if you decide to take the plunge and go with ancestry.com, you do have to pay for it, but you can access them with a subscription. So to start out your deed research, you have to have the original deed reference, like I had mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, to start your chain of title, right? So you're starting at the beginning, at the point in time that's closest to you, and you're going to go back in time and see if you can figure out who owned your property and who did it pass hands through. So I always find it very helpful, write down all the names that you see. Write down who is what party, who's the grantor, who's giving the property away, and who's receiving the property. And then, there's a lot of standard language in deeds, so you should definitely pay attention to it, but sometimes there are going to be changes in the size of the property, but you do have some key words in there, such as, contain, all that piece of property containing so many acres, more or less. And that's really, those are kind of what those keywords and key points that you should be paying attention to. And sometimes if you're really lucky, it'll say, oh, there's a frame house there or a stone dwelling. And I will drop in the chat a link to, we in Newcastle County, we do have kind of a guide about how to research your property as well. That includes a lot of the information that I'm going over tonight. So it'll be on hand, and I encourage, if you're doing deed research, it is very useful to look at. So orphan court records. These are also another really good resource to look at. So an orphan court record is a type of record that was created when a person had passed away, leaving minor children and who didn't make a will or disposition of assets. Typically, courts would assign committees to survey and determine the condition and value of real estate before the court would decide how to transfer to heirs of the deceased. The University of Delaware does have transcribed orphan court records, which is incredibly useful because you're actually able to Control F and type in keywords that you're looking for instead of trying to look through and make sense of really old handwriting, which can also be tedious when you're looking at deeds. So, an example of where this was particularly useful when the University of Delaware was preparing a National Register nomination for Homestead Hall in Newcastle County, they were able to actually read the Orphan Court records from 1846. And it had a drawing of the building with the two doors, which is a really unique feature of this building. And they were, from looking at these records and the drawing of the house, they were actually able to figure out that the service wing was added at a later date and not in 1846. There are other types of records and estate records out there. Each county has a register of wills office that you can kind of supplement your chain of title with. There are probate records, chancery court records that can also give you clues about your property. Assessment and tax records can tell you about the type of lifestyle of previous residents that lived in your building, what sort of goods were kept there, what their financial situation was. And then looking at census records, those can tell you who lived on a property at one point in time. And they can also tell you who their family members were. My watch is yelling at me. Another important or another good resource is actually looking at newspapers, old newspapers. And if you do, there's newspapers.com. That is a pretty cool resource. I believe you do have to have a subscription for that though. But newspapers are also available at the Delaware Public Archives, and you can find them pretty regularly, and there are actually some free ones too. But it can be also really exciting because you can search for whoever owned your property. You could search for their names. You could find obituaries, marriage announcements. For example, I was doing research on a house that recently came through our historic review process, and I found that I did a search of the previous owner's names, and this was in the late 19th century, and I had found that there's a newspaper article about how this family that lived on this hill were known to throw fancy parties, and they would decorate their lawn with Chinese lanterns. And this was, in the late, it was like 1890s. And I was like, how cool is that? So you can find, they used to talk about all sorts of things, which is pretty cool. So this is how I look when I'm about 4 hours deep and looking into all of these things. So where should you go to find all of these records, right? Because that's a lot of information, a lot to make sense of. I've mentioned Delaware Public Archives. It is a great first stop. They have everything. They do have digital archives. In person, I'm sure that there are COVID restrictions that have to be followed, but they do have a really, really great collections. There's a really neat postcard collection in their digital archives. They have really cool photo collections. For example, I found a really cool photo of Rodney Village shopping center in Dover with all the now antique cars. And it was really neat because, you drive down Route 13 and I don't think many people are like, that's from, the mid 20th century when the rise of the automobile was really making impacts on how we did our shopping and how we built development in the area. So they're a great place to look. The state of Delaware maintains a database of identified properties. It's not always properties that are on the National Register. They do have just information on identified buildings that might have been, pinpointed as part of a survey for being 50 years or older. But it's an interactive mapping system, and it stands for the Historical Resource Information System. And it's a great first stop to find out just, is there any information already on my property that I could build off of? There's my page. Here's my plug for my page. Newcastle County does have a historic planning page. We do have the link for researching your home's history. We do have other partners and links to other helpful places to go do research. There's also information about our historic design guidelines and historic overlay zoning, which if you're in Newcastle County and you own a historic resource, you should always consider it because it protects your property from, in the future down the road, if it were to be sold and someone were to seek demolition, the Historic Review Board does have the authority to say, oh, this is identified, that this is an important structure to the county. There are incentives for it, and such as tax credits and adaptive reuse provisions. So just always promoting historic overlay zoning. And the tax credit program, because we do receive a lot of inquiries about that one, it actually is only for unincorporated areas of Newcastle County. Because the way that our code is written, it only applies to the unincorporated areas. I always wish that I could give out more tax credits for municipalities where a lot of the historic districts are, but you can always contact your local elected officials too and lobby for one for a tax credit program. The University of Delaware Center for Historic Architecture and Design has a pretty extensive online collection kind of listed here on the screen. Where are we on time? Library of Congress also has a lot of great photographs, historic American Building Survey photos, really cool maps. I was looking at a map the other night of Delaware and the Delaware River from like 1670 or something like that, which is really cool. Hagley Museum and Library, they do have the in-person library that is currently only open by appointment only, but they do have a pretty extensive online collection as well. Delaware Historical Society, they also have some online collections and in-person collections. And then maybe there are even people who are just as excited about historic resources as you are and as I am in their spare time, and write a fantastic blog. There's often a lot of existing information out there that you can always build on. Shout out to the Mill Creek 100 history blog, because that has saved me a lot of time when I've had to research a property really quickly, and I can always build on existing information, and it's just a really, really great resource. So there's the Newcastle Community History and Archaeology program, which has a ton of information on research done in the Newcastle area, projects and archaeology that's going on in the area, and other resource links that you can go check out. Maybe your house is a little more modern and was built in the early to mid 20th century. There are a lot of really cool books, such as the Sears Roebuck catalogs, and there's even online here, the Association for Preservation Technology International. They do have the Building Technology Heritage Library, which thanks to Kate and Michael from UD for sending this to me, because I spent about 2 hours looking at everything on there. So you can kind of see what sort of building materials were available, what sort of house plans were available for people to order in the early 20th century. So that's a really neat resource as well. And I can't emphasize this book enough because it's amazing. You can learn about all sorts of different buildings in Delaware and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and the Eastern Shore of Virginia. So this is a great book. They have information on floor plans, on building styles, everything that you could ever need when looking at a building. There's also a lot of books too. I have kind of shown some here, but always be sure to check out your local library. There are some somewhat random books that you might find even through Googling, and those are also in the guide that I will send a link to. And overall, most importantly, don't forget to have fun while you're pretending to be Burt Macklin when researching your historic property. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.
Awesome, Betsy. Thank you so much. That was great. We actually do have quite a few questions for you. So just really quick before we get into that, I'm going to bring up that last poll that I had mentioned. So let's see if this works. All right, so the second poll is up. Hopefully you all can see it. Betsy, do you see the poll?
I do. Yep.
Okay. So we'll just quickly let people answer this. I don't want to take too much time away from the questions and answers, but there are two questions here. One that asks if you are currently a member of Preservation Delaware. If you aren't already and you enjoy this type of programming, it's my gentle nudge. If you are willing to support Preservation Delaware, either by becoming a member or making a donation, that would be awesome. You know, we want to keep workshops and events like this free. So, you know, membership is a big part of that. And then the second question is just asking for you to give your opinion on some potential workshop topics for future workshops. We are trying to do a workshop like this or a webinar every other month. So we're definitely interested to see where everybody's interest is. All right, so it looks like we've got about 75% of people have voted. Again, I don't want to take too much time, so I'll go ahead and go over this now. I think I can share the results. So quite a few people hopefully will consider joining PDI as a member tonight. And then as far as our topics of interest, looks like, wow, Betsy, we have a lot of interest in learning more about architectural history and styles. That's great. Preservation trades and building skills. And then kind of we're sort of tied with climate change, the African American Dumont Schools project that PDI is undertaking right now with Chad, and inclusivity and diversity in historic preservation. So that's great. We'll definitely take that into consideration. All right, Betsy. So let's get to some of these questions. I'm pulling this up here. All right, so Jamie has a question. Are there maps from before the 1840s?
There are. There are maps from before the 1840s. They can get a little harder to read. I mean, the really detailed atlases that I have found are from the mid 19th century. So if you're looking for a particular area, I have found that usually the mid 19th century is kind of where they had the best maps. That being said, you know, there are court records and there might be, you know, some hidden maps and deeds and other, you know, insurance records that you can find.
All right, great, thanks. Let's see, we've got another question. Are there any maps or atlases available in reproduction that you're aware of that might be useful? I guess if somebody wanted to maybe purchase a print of a map instead.
I'm sure I'm not sure of any particular places where you can go buy a map, but I'm sure if you search them, you probably could pay to have them downloaded and printed, you know, depending on the file size and where they're available, as long as you have the right permissions from, you know, archives and such.
Awesome. Yeah, I sort of in the same. I know there are some websites that will make a, you know, sort of reproduction for you. But I think, like you mentioned, a lot of them are available digitally if, you know, if that works. So let's see. Oh, so this is a good question. So Emily Kilby says that she's done a lot of deed research in Cecil County, Maryland, and doesn't often find direct evidence or mention of the buildings that existed on a property in the deed itself. So she's come to presume that buildings are generally erected or added onto the property at the time of ownership change. You know, is that something that you come across as well?
Yeah, I mean, there is so much just standard language in deeds. When you go read through them, you're like, wow, you know, oh, I can skip, like, once you get into the flow, you're like, oh, that's copied and pasted from the last deed. But it's not, I haven't found very often that there's references of the building. A lot of times it'll just say, including all of the buildings, water courses, ditches, etc., that exist on the property. Sometimes it happens, but a lot of times there's not a full description of buildings that are on a property in a deed. So you kind of have to supplement looking at your building and understanding, it's when it was constructed, and also looking at maps, and kind of, your research is going to supplement the deeds too, and look at wills or such too.
That's great. Yeah, kind of putting all of these different pieces of the puzzle together. All right, let's see. Got quite a few questions now. So this person heard that there was a fire long ago in Wilmington that destroyed a lot of building permit records. So there's not a lot of information about Wilmington before 1940. Do you know anything about that?
I feel like I've heard that happened, which, that's obviously frustrating when you're trying to do research. I don't know too much about it though.
Okay. I'll give a plug. She might be on tonight, but Debbie Martin is the preservation planner for the city of Wilmington. She probably would be a great resource.
Yes.
I hope Debbie doesn't mind me putting a plug in here.
Sorry, Debbie. She's very helpful though.
All right, let's see. Okay, so here is a good question. So if you don't know the deed reference, what is your advice for starting a deed search? And then can you do deed searches online, or do you have to go in person to the county offices?
Yeah, great question. So you can find a deed reference oftentimes through the GIS mapping system if you know the address of the property that you're looking for, or even if you know the vicinity of the particular property. And a lot of the mapping systems, they actually have aerials, and you can click on the parcel information, and that should have the deed reference. But if for some reason, if it's not there, you can always call your local county and ask to speak with the deeds office, and they should be able to give you the most recent deed reference, so you can have that starting point. The counties do, I believe Kent County has an online system. Newcastle County, I believe you can get to deeds on virtual or digitally up to a certain point. Once you get back to like the 30s or the 40s, that's when record keeping was a little different, and you kind of have to switch your approach and go to either UD or CHAD or the Delaware archives. Or if you have an Ancestry subscription, you can also look on Ancestry. They have them on there too.
Oh, I'm muted. So we have a question about the CHAD collection and how accessible it is to the public. I'm trying to see if we have, I know we probably have some CHAD folks on tonight. I think it's pretty accessible. You can go, I guess now with COVID, I don't know if visiting in person is an option, but I know that they did receive a grant to digitize everything. So Betsy, I know you work frequently with CHAD.
Yeah. Yep. So in the presentation, I did also include a link to UD Space. So they do have a lot of the orphan court records you can just get through the internet. The folks at CHAD, they might have a little more in person or a little more insight as to that, but from the online and the digital resources are they're open to the public from what I was able to get to.
Awesome. All right, so we've got a question about Sussex County in particular. So this person is familiar with the 1868 Beers Atlas, but is wondering if there are earlier detailed maps that you're aware of for Sussex County.
That I'm aware of, I'm not as familiar with Sussex County, unfortunately. I haven't found any earlier ones, but again, there might be some UD folks, or I believe they have a historic preservation planner down there too that you can contact. I haven't found one for Sussex County easily, but I wouldn't be surprised if one existed.
That's great. I can,
Yeah.
I will provide, Dan Parsons is the
Yes.
Sussex County Preservation Planner, so I can provide, he's a great resource, would be great to know a specific question like that. Let me see. Okay, so we sort of a related question. Is research data for deed information in Sussex County as, quote, plentiful and accessible as it is for Newcastle County?
It should be. I haven't done a ton of deed research in Sussex County, and I would also, refer to Dan down there too. But I mean, deeds office, from what I've seen, deeds offices are pretty standard, so you should be able to do some deed research.
Yeah, I'd add that at least my experience has been that yeah, it is very accessible. I think Sussex County, I think they actually have their deeds available digitally online to 1950. So 1950 to the present. So anything older you would have to go visit in person. But all right, so we have a question about carbon dating. This is kind of very specific and technical, but I know with your University of Mary Washington background, I know they do a lot of work with that. Let me find the specific question here. Yeah, so about sort of trees and wood, can you carbon test structural components to help date the structure?
Yeah, I personally don't have a ton of experience in that, but there are, there's dendrochronology that you can take. You can take cores of wood to kind of figure out what type and have it tested. There's, the University of Mary Washington, they also do x-rays of buildings, which is actually pretty cool. They did a really neat x-ray of the Mary Washington House in downtown Fredericksburg, and you can kind of see the different features and how it changed over time. So yeah, there are ways to actually test the materials too.
So let's see, I know we're at 6:59, so we are getting close. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Maybe we'll take one more question, Betsy, if that's okay with you. Let's see if I can find one here. What's the most interesting or shocking thing you've come across in your property research?
Let's see here. So there's a couple different, there was one property in Newport, Newcastle that, and I think Kate and Michael from UD have also found this too, but one of the previous owners, one of the wives of the owners that built this house off Newport Pike, apparently people didn't like her, and there was actually a poem written about how awful she was. And I found that pretty entertaining. But when you look and do research, you really learn a lot about people's lives, and you can it's easy to get attached and kind of really feel for what people have gone through in the past, and kind of trying to understand what life must have been like for them, at a certain point in time. It's really exciting. There was one property that I was researching recently where we ended up finding out that Thomas Edison's son actually lived in Green Bank, Delaware. And there is this house that apparently, there's really prominent Congress people lived in this house in Green Bank, Delaware. And it's kind of, off the beaten path and kind of in a forgotten area. And I always get really excited when I find out those things, Thomas Edison's son stayed here. And, there is a congressman from the 30s that, was elected and lived on the property, and he apparently didn't like farm life, so he moved. And you just find really, really cool stories like that really, that really keep you going and keep you excited to keep researching.
Well, that's great, Betsy. Thanks so much. I know we do have some other questions that we didn't get to, and we'll be able to save all of those from the Q&A in the chat function. So we will work together with Betsy to try to get everybody answers to outstanding questions. Betsy, I think you had mentioned your contact information. I don't know if you would be willing or if that's available on the county's website.
It is. Yep, I can put it in the chat too. So always feel free to give me an email, and I'm happy to answer questions too. So
That
I
would
this was kind of a high level, I covered a lot. So, I know there's a lot more specifics too that people have questions over.
Absolutely. All right. Well, again, I don't want to keep anybody too long. I know we said we'd be an hour. Betsy, I want to thank you again. Massive, massive thanks for your effort on this. I thought it was great. Yeah, like you said, a lot to cover, but I think you did a really great job of highlighting everything. So thank you again for taking the time, and thanks to all of our attendees for making